February 13th, 1943, Solomon Islands. The morning sun broke across Guadalcanal's Henderson Field in sheets of gold and copper, casting long shadows from the palm trees that hadn't yet been shredded by artillery fire. Lieutenant Masao Sato sat in the cramped cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, his gloved hands resting on the control stick as ground crews made their final checks. The air smelled of aviation fuel and salt water, that peculiar cocktail of war in the Pacific. Through his canopy, he could see 17 other Zeros being prepared for the morning patrol, their polished aluminum skins gleaming like the scales of some mechanical fish. Sato had flown 73 combat missions since the war began. He had shot down 6 American aircraft. He had never been shot down himself. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the tropical heat already building inside the cockpit, and allowed himself a brief prayer to his ancestors. When he opened them again, he saw something on the horizon that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about air combat. A dark silhouette approaching from the southeast, bent wings, moving impossibly fast. The Pacific War had been raging for 14 months when the F4U Corsair first entered combat operations in the Solomon Islands. For the Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, those 14 months had represented a calculated descent from supremacy to desperation. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots had flown with the confidence of men who knew their Zero fighters outperformed anything the Americans could field. The A6M was a masterpiece of engineering compromise, lightweight, nimble, capable of outturning any opponent in a dogfight. Its 20mm cannons could tear an enemy aircraft apart in seconds. From December 1941 through the summer of 1942, Zero pilots had dominated the skies from Hawaii to Australia, from the Indian Ocean to the Aleutians. They had been told their enemies were soft, unprepared, flying inferior machines piloted by men more concerned with comfort than glory. For a time, this appeared to be true, but wars are won not by opening gambits, but by industrial capacity and innovation. While Japanese pilots were perfecting their combat techniques in Zeros that remained essentially unchanged from their 1940 design, American factories were producing something new. The chance-vought F4U Corsair was not an incremental improvement over existing fighters. It was a revolution. Its inverted gull wing, that distinctive bent shape that would become iconic, was designed to accommodate the largest propeller ever mounted on a fighter aircraft, while keeping the landing gear short enough for carrier operations. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double that of the Zero. It could reach speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. It could climb to 20,000 feet in less than 8 minutes. It carried 6 50 caliber machine guns with enough ammunition to sustain 24 seconds of continuous fire. But these were just numbers. What those numbers meant in combat would not become clear until men like Masao Sato encountered the Corsair in the killing skies above the Solomon Islands. The psychological architecture of Japanese pilot training had been built around the Zero's capabilities. Trainers at Tsuchiura and Kasumagara air stations taught their students to trust in maneuverability above all else. Speed could be matched, altitude could be gained, but in a turning fight, the Zero was supreme. This doctrine had served them well against the Brewster Buffaloes and early model Wildcats they encountered in the war's first year. Japanese pilots learned to draw their opponents into circling duels where superior turn radius guaranteed victory. They learned to use their aircraft's extraordinary range to strike targets American fighters couldn't reach and return home safely. They learned, above all, that their enemies would try to run from them in a straight line, and that a Zero could eventually catch any American fighter foolish enough to try. The Corsair made liars of their instructors. When the first F4U squadrons arrived at Henderson Field in February 1943, Japanese intelligence officers struggled to categorize what they were seeing. Reconnaissance photographs showed an aircraft with peculiar bent wings and an enormous propeller. Interrogations of captured American ground crew revealed fragments of information. Something about engine displacement, about maximum speed figures that seemed impossible. The numbers were dismissed as propaganda or misinformation. No single engine fighter could be that fast. No aircraft that large could climb that quickly. The Americans were exaggerating, as Americans always did, inflating the capabilities of their machines to compensate for the inadequacy of their pilots. This was the comfortable assumption. It lasted until the first dogfight. Combat reports from Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Corsairs in those early months read like dispatches from men who had encountered something supernatural. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces with over 60 kills, described his first Corsair engagement in his journal. The enemy aircraft approached from above and behind, moving at a speed I had never witnessed in combat. I broke hard left, executing a maximum performance turn that would have put me on the tail of any Zero, any Wildcat, any aircraft I had previously fought. The American simply continued his dive, extending away from me as though I were standing still. I could not believe what I was seeing. He gained 3,000 feet of altitude before I completed my turn. Then he came again. What Sakai was experiencing was the fundamental destruction of Japanese air combat doctrine. The Corsair pilots weren't fighting the way Americans were supposed to fight. They weren't engaging in turning duels. They were employing a tactic that would come to be known as boom and zoom, diving from superior altitude, making a single high-speed pass, then using their excess energy to climb back to safety before the Zero pilots could react. It was a style of combat that played to every one of the Corsair's strengths and negated every advantage the Zero possessed. And for Japanese pilots, trained to expect desperate turning fights, it was bewildering. The psychological impact went beyond tactical confusion. Japanese pilot training had instilled a particular worldview in its graduates. That victory came through spiritual purity and martial skill. That the superior warrior would prevail regardless of material circumstances. That dedication and honor mattered more than horsepower and engineering. The Zero embodied this philosophy. It sacrificed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks for the sake of performance and range. Its pilots sacrificed comfort and safety for the sake of agility. This was the warrior's path. But now they faced an enemy who had chosen differently, who had built an aircraft that didn't ask its pilot to choose between protection and performance, who had the industrial capacity to mass-produce machines that were simply better in almost every measurable category. It was a confrontation not just between aircraft, but between philosophies of war. A data tells the story that individual testimonies sometimes cannot. In the 6 months before the Corsair entered combat operations, Japanese pilots in the Solomons maintained an approximate kill ratio of 1.3 to 1 against American fighters. Not the dominant superiority of 1941, but still favorable. Within 3 months of the Corsair's introduction, that ratio had reversed to approximately 1 to 3. By mid-1944, Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios of better than 10 to 1 in some engagements. These numbers represented more than tactical superiority. They represented the erosion of Japanese air power itself. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. Japan's training programs, already stretched by the demands of a multi-front war, could not produce new pilots as quickly as they were being shot down. And the Corsair was shooting them down at an unprecedented rate. A high-altitude performance advantage was particularly devastating. The Corsair's turbocharged engine, eventually replaced by the more reliable two-stage supercharger in later models, allowed it to maintain combat effectiveness above 25,000 feet. At that altitude, the Zero's lightweight design became a crippling disadvantage. The thin air that required less engine power to maintain speed also provided less lift for maneuvering. Zero pilots found their aircraft becoming sluggish and unresponsive at altitudes where the Corsair was just reaching peak performance. American pilots learned to drag Japanese fighters upward, climbing in a shallow spiral until the Zeros began to shudder and wallow. Then the Corsairs would roll over and dive, building up tremendous speed, firing one devastating burst as they flashed past, then zooming back to altitude before the Japanese pilots could even orient themselves. It was execution by physics. Lieutenant Sato survived his first encounter with a Corsair, but his wingman did not. The report he filed that evening was marked with the red stamp, indicating unusual enemy capabilities requiring immediate attention. He described an aircraft that had dived on his formation from 28,000 feet, destroyed 1-0 with a 2-second burst of gunfire, then climbed back to 30,000 feet while the remaining Japanese fighters were still trying to turn to engage. The speed differential, he estimated, was at least 100 miles per hour. His recommendation was stark. Do not engage this aircraft in conventional combat. Avoid if possible. If engagement is unavoidable, attack only in coordinated groups and only when holding altitude advantage. Within weeks, similar reports were flooding into Japanese Naval Air Force headquarters. The pattern was undeniable. The Americans had fielded a fighter that fundamentally changed the calculus of air combat in the Pacific. But acknowledgement of the problem did not produce solutions. Japanese aircraft designers, already struggling with material shortages and the demands of multiple development programs, could not simply create a Corsair equivalent. The industrial base did not exist. The R2800 engine that powered the Corsair required manufacturing precision and metallurgical expertise that Japanese factories, bombed and starved of raw materials, could not reliably duplicate. The Japanese did develop new fighters, the Kawanishi N1K George, the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, eventually the Nakajima Ki-84 Frank, that could compete more effectively with American aircraft. But these came in limited numbers, often suffered from quality control issues, and arrived too late to alter the trajectory of the air war. The Corsair, meanwhile, was being produced at a rate of over 500 per month. By early 1944, Chance Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster factories were turning them out in numbers that Japanese intelligence officers initially refused to believe. The symbolic weight of the Corsair extended beyond its technical capabilities. For Japanese pilots, the aircraft became a physical manifestation of American industrial might. Every time that distinctive silhouette appeared on the horizon, it was a reminder that their enemy could afford to build fighters with 2,000 horsepower engines, with 6 heavy machine guns, with armor plate and self-sealing tanks, and all the weight penalties those protective measures entailed. The Zero had been designed by engineers who had to count every kilogram. The Corsair had been designed by engineers who could add capability after capability, without worrying whether the final product would be too heavy or too expensive. This disparity in design philosophy reflected a deeper economic reality that Japanese pilots were beginning to understand viscerally. They were fighting an enemy who could outproduce them by factors they could barely comprehend. There was a moment, recorded in multiple Japanese pilot memoirs, that captures this realization with particular clarity. In August 1943, a formation of 12 Zeros intercepted what appeared to be a damaged Corsair, trailing smoke near New Georgia. The Japanese pilots, following their training, moved to attack. As they closed, 16 additional Corsairs dropped from the clouds above them. It had been bait. In the furious engagement that followed, 7 Zeros were shot down. Not a single Corsair was lost. One surviving Japanese pilot, Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Nishizawa, later wrote, "We had flown into a trap, but that was not what disturbed me most. What disturbed me was that the Americans could afford to use such an advanced fighter as bait, that they could risk a Corsair to destroy Zeros the way a fisherman uses a hook to catch fish. We would never have done such a thing with our own aircraft. We could not afford to." The speed advantage was perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of the Corsair's superiority. In aerial combat, speed represents freedom. A faster aircraft can choose whether to engage or disengage. It can dictate the terms of combat. A slower aircraft is trapped by circumstance. Japanese pilots in Zeros found themselves in the unaccustomed position of being unable to escape from fights that were going badly. Even when they recognized a tactical disadvantage, even when they executed a perfect disengaging maneuver, the Corsairs could follow them. This inverted the power dynamic that had defined Pacific air combat since Pearl Harbor. Now it was American pilots who decided when the fight began and when it ended. Japanese pilots could only react. A high-altitude advantage compounded this dynamic. Corsair pilots learned to patrol at 30,000 feet or higher, well above the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters. From that altitude, they had an unrestricted view of the battle space below them. They could observe Japanese formations, select targets, coordinate their attacks, and then dive with all the energy advantage that altitude provided. By the time Japanese pilots spotted the incoming Corsairs, the Americans were already moving at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, crossing the distance from 30,000 feet to 20,000 in seconds. The defensive maneuver that had saved so many Zero pilots in earlier engagements, the hard brake turn that forced an attacking enemy to overshoot, was useless against an aircraft diving that fast. The Corsair pilot would fire his burst, then use his excess speed to zoom climb back to altitude, untouchable. It was a form of combat that required patience and discipline rather than dogfighting skill, and it slaughtered Japanese pilots who had spent years perfecting techniques that were suddenly obsolete. Lieutenant Sato flew his last mission on November 7th, 1943. His aircraft was one of 8 Zeros assigned to escort a formation of Betty bombers attacking American shipping near Bougainville. The combat report filed by the mission commander noted that the escort fighters encountered approximately 20 F4U type enemy fighters at altitude advantage. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. 5 Zeros were destroyed, including Sato's. None of the American fighters were shot down. The Betty bombers were decimated. This was not an unusual outcome. By late 1943, such lopsided casualties had become routine. Japanese pilots were dying at a rate that their training pipeline could not sustain, and the Corsair was the primary instrument of that destruction. The American pilots flying those Corsairs were not superhuman. Many were young men with less than a year of flight training, fresh from the farms of Iowa and the factories of Detroit. What they possessed was not superior spiritual cultivation or martial heritage, but superior machinery and superior tactics designed to maximize that machinery's advantages. Major Greg Boyington, commanding officer of VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron. Squadron achieved 28 confirmed kills flying the Corsair. When asked about the aircraft in a post-war interview, his assessment was characteristically blunt. The Japanese had nothing that could touch us if we flew smart. We had speed, we had climb, we had altitude, we had firepower. All we had to do was not be stupid enough to try to turn fight with them. The Corsair made it easy to not be stupid. This was the ultimate humiliation for Japanese pilots, trained in a tradition that emphasized personal skill and spiritual preparation. Their defeat was being engineered by young Americans who were simply following a checklist. Boom and zoom tactics required discipline and teamwork, but not the years of training that creating a zero ace demanded. The Corsair had democratized air superiority, made it something that could be mass-produced along with the aircraft itself. Japanese pilot training took 3 years to produce a competent fighter pilot. American training could produce a dangerous Corsair pilot in 8 months. The mathematics were inexorable. By 1944, Japanese naval aviation was effectively defeated as a strategic force, and the Corsair was a primary cause. The aircraft went on to serve with devastating effectiveness through the rest of the Pacific War, during the Korean War, and even saw limited service in the early years of the Vietnam conflict. Over 12,000 were built. The sound of that massive propeller, a distinctive whistling howl that Japanese troops called whistling death, became one of the most feared sounds in the Pacific theater. Ground troops would dive for cover at that sound. Fighter pilots would search desperately for an escape route. It was the sound of American industrial power made manifest. The sound of a nation that can afford to give its pilots the best fighter aircraft in the world and produce them faster than the enemy could shoot them down. The bent-wing bird, as American pilots called it, represented something more profound than tactical superiority. It represented the collision between two incompatible visions of modern warfare. The Japanese vision had emphasized spiritual dedication tactical brilliance, and engineering elegance within resource constraints. It had produced the Zero, a beautiful, deadly aircraft that perfectly embodied its design philosophy. The American vision emphasized overwhelming material superiority, continuous innovation, and the willingness to spend lavishly on capability. It had produced the Corsair, a brutal, powerful aircraft that solved problems by adding more engine, more guns, more armor. In the skies above the Solomon Islands and the Philippines and Okinawa, these philosophies met in combat, and the material vision won. Not because American pilots were braver or more skillful, but because they were riding machines that were simply, demonstrably, crushingly superior. There is a photograph taken at Okinawa in May 1945 that captures something essential about this transformation. In the foreground, a Corsair sits on a muddy airstrip, its bent wings and massive propeller dominating the frame. In the background, barely visible, is the burned-out wreckage of a Zero, pushed to the side of the runway like debris. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The Corsair is intact, ready for another mission, already being refueled by ground crew. The Zero is finished, destroyed, discarded. One aircraft represents a military force, at the peak of its power, backed by factories producing thousands of aircraft per month, piloted by young men who know they have the best equipment and the industrial might to sustain it. The other represents a military force in its death throes, unable to replace losses, unable to match enemy capabilities, watching its most experienced pilots die in aircraft that were obsolete before the war even reached its midpoint. Zero had been designed to be perfect within its constraints. The Corsair had been designed without accepting constraints. That difference, the fundamental philosophical divergence about what was possible and what was worth sacrificing, determined which aircraft would survive and which would become wreckage pushed to the side of history. Japanese pilot trainee Takeo Tadamizu, who graduated from flight school in February 1945, recorded in his diary the advice given to him by his instructor, one of the few surviving veterans of the 1942 campaigns. The Corsair is faster than you. It climbs better than you. It has more guns than you. It has more armor than you. The pilot probably has more training time than you. He has more ammunition than you. He has better radio equipment than you. He has more fuel than you. He will have friends nearby who can help him. You will probably be alone. This is the situation. Accept it. Find a way to be useful anyway. This was what the air war had become for Japan by 1945. A desperate search for ways to be useful against an enemy who had superiority in every measurable category. The Corsair's dominance was not merely a tactical development, but a psychological one. It changed what Japanese pilots believed was possible, what they could hope to achieve, how they understood their own role in the war. Where once they had flown with the confidence of men who held the technological edge, now they flew with the fatalism of men who knew they were overmatched. This shift in psychology was as devastating as the physical destruction the aircraft inflicted. An air force that believes it cannot win fights differently than an air force that believes victory is possible. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots believed. They fought with courage and sometimes with skill, but they flew into combat knowing the Corsairs they would face were better than their own aircraft in almost every way that mattered. That knowledge was corrosive. It ate away at morale, at unit cohesion, at the willingness to take the risks that effective air combat required. The F4U Corsair shot down over 2,000 Japanese aircraft during World War II. It maintained an overall kill ratio of better than 11-1. These numbers represent individual tragedies, young Japanese pilots dying in flames over Pacific islands, experienced aces like Masao Sato killed by burst of .50 caliber fire, aircraft disintegrating under the hammering impact of 6 machine guns firing in unison. But they also represent something larger, the defeat of one nation's military philosophy by another's industrial capacity. Japan had bet on quality over quantity, on tactical excellence over material superiority, on spiritual preparation over engineering innovation. The Corsair proved those bets wrong, not because quality and training and spirit didn't matter, but because they couldn't overcome the disparity in resources and technology that separated the combatants. In the end, the bent-wing bird became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of how wars between industrial nations are won, not by the most dedicated soldiers or the most elegant engineering or the most refined tactical doctrine, but by the nation that can afford to give its warriors the best tools and produce those tools in crushing abundance. The Corsair was not the best fighter aircraft of World War II by every measure, but it was good enough, tough enough, fast enough, and produced in sufficient numbers to destroy an air force that had once seemed invincible. That combination of adequate excellence and overwhelming quantity is what victory looked like in the industrial age of warfare. The Japanese pilots who survived the war carried the memory of that distinctive silhouette with them. Some became instructors in the post-war Japanese self-defense forces, teaching new generations of pilots in aircraft provided by their former enemies. Some became engineers, contributing to Japan's post-war economic miracle. But none forgot the sound of the Corsair's engine, the shape of those bent wings, the helpless feeling of watching it dive from altitude, knowing there was nothing their Zero could do to escape. It was a lesson written in fire and speed and the torn metal of 1,000 crashed aircraft. The price of that education was paid in the blood of young men who had been told their spirit would be enough. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. And somewhere above the Pacific, perhaps, Lieutenant Masao Sato learned this truth in the last seconds before a Corsair's guns found him. One hopes the knowledge came quickly, if it had to come at all.